Okay, so like I said, we're going to start by kind of unpacking the drums. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute everything that's not drums so that we can make sure we're focusing on the right thing. So in this particular session, I have 9 tracks of drums, 9 inputs that are 2 kicks, 2 snares, so kick in, kick out, snare top, snare bottom, hi-hat, 2 toms, and overheads. And so I think one of the biggest things about mixing analog, and this is such an important kind of corollary in terms of transitioning from analog to digital, is understanding how important gain structure is in the way the electronics of these consoles work. It's funny. I mean, I keep sort of filtering this discussion through somebody who is maybe a young person starting out in mixing in church, and they're on a digital console and they've never seen any of this stuff. Because I'm an old guy and this is how I got my start. So this is actually exciting for me because a large format analog console is a great way to understand a lot of the basic principles of audio. So signal flow and gain structure are super important, but on an analog desk, it's really easy. So each of these strips, each of these faders is what's called a channel strip. Now, you've seen that in your digital console. You know, the selected channel becomes kind of your channel strip, but that name comes from the fact that this is actually a long strip. So we have, at the very top of the strip, we have our 48 volts and pad switch, but then we've got a gain knob and then a high pass filter, an EQ section, auxes, group assignments, a pan knob, a mute button, and a fader. And so for each of these 56 channels, that layout is exactly the same. So now some digital consoles allow you to put your compression before your EQ, or they have compression and gating on every channel, or you can decide where the insert point is for a plug-in or an effect. That's not the case on these old guys, right? This is a very structured layout. You know, you unbox this thing and you get a wiring diagram, and it tells you exactly how the transistors and capacitors and all the electronics in these channel strips are wired, and that's basically it. So we start always with our gain knob. Now, we have tracks that are coming in from our playback machine, XLR into the desk, and they've been recorded at a certain level. So our gain knob is really acting as kind of a trim for those tracks. But if you were bringing in a live microphone, you know, you set your gain, and on this console, we have 4 indicators. There's -15, 0, +12, and +18, and the 18 is red. So that's clipping. Analog clipping is a real thing. So we really want, in analog gain structure, I really want all of my inputs to kind of be peaking around 0. So that second green light. So we've got plenty of headroom, but we've got a robust enough input that when we send something out an aux send to a reverb or insert a compressor, there's enough signal to make those things work effectively. So as you can see, I've got all of my drums kind of hitting around 0. Especially with drums, it's important to be in mind of those peaks. You know, the transients of a snare drum are going to be a lot louder than maybe, you know, your hi-hat, or a different channel, you know, your acoustic guitar or your vocal might not have the same kind of transients as a snare drum. So want to make sure that that crack of the snare drum is not causing us to go into the red. So let's just listen to the drums and kind of hear what we're doing. Okay, so that's our drum kit. You're listening to the signals as I process them. So you're hearing EQ, you're hearing compression, you're hearing gating. So what I'd like to do is maybe go to our kick and snare and just turn that off so you can hear the direct inputs. I'll bypass the gates and compressors so you can hear just kind of kicks and snares the way they were captured. So I'm going to bypass these units. And I'm going to turn my EQ off, just on those 4 channels. So kick in, kick out, snare top, snare bottom. So for sure on the kicks, You can hear it's a little more woofy. There's not a whole lot of attack. So this particular drum has a pretty dark sound. You know, that drum itself is dark. Maybe the beater is softer instead of a real kind of hard mallet. Maybe it's just kind of a more of a kind of covered sound. So I like a kick drum that has a lot of attack. So the great thing about these Midas consoles is that the EQ is really responsive. You'll notice when I add some top end, it's going to be like, oh wow, there it is. Sometimes with digital consoles, you know, you don't get that kind of response. The way analog EQ works, just from the circuitry itself, I really think that, you know, you turn the knob a little bit and you can actually hear it. That's one thing that I love about this Midas console and analog consoles in general. So what I'll do is I'll flatten out kind of some of what we've done so that we can kind of rebuild the EQ of our kick. I'll put the EQ in and let's listen. So you can hear I've got a mid-range cut, you know, about, I don't know, 400 or 500 hertz, cutting a lot of that, boosting some top end around 10K, and then boosting some bottom end around 60 to 70 hertz. So again, it's a real kind of, it's a more, I don't know, impactful to me kick drum. But we also want to talk about gating and compression. The way our digital consoles work, you have that kind of built into the channel strip, like I said in the introductory video. This, we don't have that. We have an insert point. So basically we have an analog insert where we can, you know, back in the day it was like I'd show up to a festival and we'd have 4 comps and 4 gates. Where do you want to put them? You know, because there's a cable that actually goes into the channel path, the signal path, and then goes out and back from the outboard gate or compressor. So what we have here is several Drummer MX30s, which is actually a gate, a compressor, and a limiter built in one. And so it's a really great flexible unit. In this case, I'm using the gate and the compressor. So I'm gonna, basically they're bypassed right now. So let's listen to just the first kick drum. So you can hear the toms and the snare and the cymbals, like it's not just kick drum. So we want to try to dial it in such that we're just focusing on the kick. We can get rid of all the extra stuff that we don't want to hear from our kick drum. You know, I find when I'm dialing in a gate, I don't want to lose all of the other stuff because it sounds really choky. Like if it's just the kick, then it might choke out too much. So I'm really trying to kind of find a happy medium between getting rid of some of, especially crash cymbals and that kind of thing, but keep the body of the kick drum intact. And then I'm also doing a little bit of compression here, but I kind of like that on kick drum. So I think we're in a pretty good spot. Great. So we're kind of doing the same thing with the other kick drum. I'll just bypass that one as well. So we're really kind of isolating the sound so that we can kind of have a more focused input for those kicks. So it's very similar to the snare drum. Let's listen with those inserts bypassed, but we'll kind of, you know, get with the EQ on the snare top. So without the EQ, that's pretty dark. It's pretty thuddy. You know, I'm not a huge fan of the sound of that drum, so we're going to need to figure out if we can kind of add some life to it. So EQ is the way we're going to do that. So you'll notice here I've got quite a big boost at 10K, a big boost at about 4K to get some of that crack. and then I'm cutting, around 400 hertz, and then boosting some bottom end too. I really want some of the body of the drum. So I'll just turn the EQ on and you can hear the difference. So to me, that brings some life to it. Now, let me bring the gate in there so we can kind of get rid of some of that hi-hat, and then we'll add a little bit of compression and see what we have with our snare drum. So again, we have a little bit of the cymbals when they're really loud, but we don't have any of the hi-hat bleed, and we don't have any of the kicks. So I think we have a pretty good isolated snare drum sound. So basically we've done the same thing with the snare bottom. So we'll just put those together so you can hear them in partnership. So I'm relying on the snare bottom for some of the sparkle, some more of that high end. I've got the high frequency boost that I have on the snare bottom is quite a bit more than the snare top because I'm really trying to capture the sound, the sizzliness of those snares. So let's put kick and snare together just to make sure that we're in a good spot. Great, so in my mind, we've got a lot of attack, a lot of punchiness, that's great. Now I'm going to bring in the overheads just to make sure our kicks and snares and cymbals are kind of playing along well together. Let's add hi-hat and toms now. So I think our drums are coming together pretty well. We'll see what happens when we get the rest of the instruments in there to see what we might need to boost or change about the tonality. But I'm getting pretty happy with where they are. Now, one thing that I want to point out, because some of you who may have analog consoles at your church may have further limitations beyond just gating and compression. You may be limited on your number of outboard effects. So in this case, for this mix, we only have one reverb and we have one delay. So we could have a second reverb by not having delay on our vocals, but I feel like a delay actually gives the vocals a nice kind of space to live in and brings an extra sense of body to the sound of the mix. So I don't want to necessarily get rid of the delay, but with only one reverb, that means that my snare drum, my toms, my acoustic guitar, my piano, and my vocal might all have to share the sound of one reverb. So we'll see if that causes us compromises later on. But for now, let's put a little bit of that verb on our snare drum so we can kind of round out the sound of our kit. I mean, to me, having the snare drum and the other drums that are appropriate, toms, maybe overheads, having them in some sort of space just gives a different kind of life to the sound of the kit. So I'm getting pretty happy with where we are. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is, group processing. I am sending these drums, you'll notice these buttons here are groups. So I'm sending all of these drums to groups 1 and 2, which are showing up on these blue faders here. And so I have another compressor, a stereo compressor, that's inserted on those groups to give us a sound of compression for the kit as a whole. So what I feel like that does is just kind of adds an extra little bit of glue, an extra little bit of to the sound of the drums. So let's take a listen to that and see if we can hear what that's doing. I'll start without it, and when you see me bring these blue faders up, that means the compression is coming in. Now that's in addition to the compression that I'm doing on the individual channels. So this is compression to the drums as a whole. That adds a nice bit of life to them, to my ears, which I really like. What I like to do is take the drums out of the stereo bus so we can hear just the compression. So then you can hear exactly how much that's doing. So let me remove all the individual drums from the stereo bus so you're only hearing the group. You can see if you look at this meter here, there's a lot of gain reduction happening. It really creates kind of a washiness, and those cymbals are really starting to kind of pump a little bit. I really feel like that adds kind of a different kind of life to the sound. So let's listen just to the compression again, and then I'll bring in the drums around it. So I think our drums are in a pretty good place to start bringing in some of our other instruments. But a couple of reminders. Gain structure is massively important, especially with drums when you have all those transients and spikes in the level. You want to make sure that you're not peaking out your analog circuitry because you don't want to damage those inputs. Unlike a digital desk, there are delicate components in here that really could kind of fail over time if that impact was too much for too long. Also, EQ is your friend on an analog desk. I mean, I love that when I turn the knob, I can actually hear what it's doing. It's great. Now, your layout might have different numbers of groups and different options for routing. Again, I'm just showing you what I'm doing here, but I think, doing that group compression as an example of how to use groups is a good way to kind of bring your drums to life. So I hope this is helpful. Let's move on. We're going to add the rest of our instruments to our mix.